I'm Autumn Lockett.
And this is Mitch Randall.
And you're listening to Good Faith Weekly.
Welcome to Good Faith Weekly. And on this episode, Autumn and I travel to Tulsa, Oklahoma as Good Faith Media visits Tulsa to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre. And then later on the pod, Autumn and I sat down with Reverend Elizabeth Hagan to talk about her new book, Brave Church. So you want to stay tuned for that interview because Reverend Hagan was a delight to visit with.
I'm Reverend Starlette Thomas, a womanist in ministry and the host of a new podcast, The Raceless Gospel, from Good Faith Media. We're going to talk about that taboo trinity, race, religion, and politics. Season 1 of The Raceless Gospel has 5 episodes, 5 Sundays, if you will. We're going to take you to church each episode. We're going to talk about the sticks and stones, the skin and bones of Christian discipleship through the structure of a church service. And each episode, we're joined by a special guest who will bring a word. The Raceless Gospel Podcast. 5 episodes, all available March 22nd. I'm your podcast pastor, Reverend Starlette Thomas. Join us as we march into and beyond race, religion, and politics. Learn more at goodfaithmedia.org.
Autumn, we've been on the road. In fact, I'm still on the road in Tulsa, Oklahoma this week.
We have been. It was incredible. I only came up for a little portion of the week that you all have spent there in Tulsa covering so much ground and so many important topics. But I think you should probably tell people what's going on in Tulsa, because some people probably don't know, and that's probably not even their fault.
Right. Well, hopefully, as our audience may or may not know, May 31st to June 1st was the 100th anniversary that commemorated the Tulsa Race Massacre. For a long time, it was called the Tulsa Race Riot, but that was negative connotations and inaccurate in its description. The reality was that this was a massacre, and over 300 people lost their lives due to blatant racism that was fueled by the media and by a culture that wanted to suppress the Black community in Tulsa. And it was really a moving week, to say the least. We attended church services. We attended a prayer vigil, a dedication of a prayer wall at Vernon AME Church that was burned to the ground back in 1921. A lot of dignitaries came in and out of Tulsa. President Biden was here giving remarks to the 3 survivors as well as community leaders. It was just really a remarkable week. And I learned so much. Now, what was heartbreaking for me as someone who grew up in Tulsa, grew up on the east side of Tulsa, ended up graduating on the south side of Tulsa, but attended Tulsa public schools and Union public schools all my life. I never learned about the Tulsa Race Massacre until I was an adult. And I was absolutely astonished.
Those places where we were, like, you grew up driving right by them and just had no idea that you were in a sacred space.
Yeah, no clue whatsoever. Just no clues whatsoever. And it infuriated me. It also broke my heart, depending on who you're talking to, because African Americans in Tulsa felt like they could never talk about what happened because they were fearful for their life.
Yep.
You heard stories of children watching their parents and aunts and uncles getting shot right in front of them. And then the ramifications after the massacre. It took 18 hours to burn 12 miles of the city. The economic devastation was just insurmountable. And so the African American community felt like they could never talk about this because of the consequences that they would face by even bringing it up. And then, of course, you had the white community here in Tulsa. Obviously, Tulsa's predominantly white. Just wanted to bury it. And the symbolism of discovering the remains at Oak Lawn Cemetery there in Tulsa, where they basically had a mass grave where they just dumped bodies in. is telling because it was almost as though it was the perfect metaphor, and it wasn't even a metaphor, it's real, of covering up history.
Mm-hmm.
Bury it deep into the ground and let's just never talk about it again.
Yeah.
And so the fact now that we're talking about it, we're coming to some understanding of not only what happened in those 18 horrific hours on May 31st, 1921, and then what has happened afterward. We've got a long way to go, and there needs to be a lot of answers to a lot of questions that are being posed, and there needs to be justice. There's yet to be a government, whether that is the city of Tulsa, the state of Oklahoma, or the United States, have ever officially acknowledged what took place there as a crime.
I think all three of them need to answer for that. All three.
We've had certain politicians, such as mayors, governors, and the president, acknowledge what has happened. That's a step forward, but there has never been. This was a crime. This is a crime scene for 12 blocks. This was a crime scene. It's a terrorist act. It's a domestic terrorist attack, and there's been no justice. There's been no any attempt to bring about justice to the victims that took place, the generational victims that took place, as well as the community itself. And the thing that was telling for me is that people lost their life on that day, but not only that, an entire generation, because Black Wall Street there at Greenwood was a thriving community. And it wasn't just one street. You go down to Greenwood right now and you see it's just about a block. It was 12 miles of thriving industry and neighborhoods. I mean, it was really the jewel of African Americans in the entire United States. It was really a remarkable place. And in 18 hours, it was completely destroyed. And then over the next 100 years, it was never allowed to be rebuilt because of policies instilled by the city of Tulsa, the state of Oklahoma, and the federal government that's continued to suppress generation after generation. And so generational economic development stopped in 1921 and was never allowed to prosper again. And now today you hear politicians, just saying, well, that happened 100 years ago. Why should we, answer for what happened 100 years ago? Well, because your family, your community didn't suffer the way this community did. And it wasn't just 18 hours on 2 days in 21. Yeah. It was the 100 years after the fact and continues in today. The ramifications of that one event are still in effect today. And so
it's continuing. And I think that's one of the most haunting things is that you can still see the footprint. I mean, you can see grand lawns with stairs going up to nothing. You can see the little pavers in the sidewalk of what business was there and whether or not it was rebuilt. And here's the thing, I found myself I would go down 3, not rebuilt, not rebuilt, not rebuilt. I'd see a paver that says rebuilt. But even I would feel a little spark of, oh, good for them. They were able to rebuild. But I'm picturing it in my mind. But to what end? Who could come and spend money there because they had nothing? It was completely wiped out.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just been a really moving week for me. And again, I when I found out about 21, I did research myself, but just being here on the ground, listening to community leaders, listening to the stories of survivors, descendants of survivors, has just once again rocked my world and has convinced me that we have created a system here in the United States that is not only suppressive, but oppressive of people of color, especially African American communities. And we've got to do better. And let me say this, probably the most paramount thing of the week is that white communities always want to rush to reconciliation. There's a lot of talk about reconciliation. We've got to bridge the gap between white and black or white and brown. But we've got a lot of hard work to do before we get to reconciliation. And that hard work is justice. And I'm going to throw a word out here that not very many people like, and that's reparations.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I go back to the fact that, yes, this happened 100 years ago over an 18-hour period, but the ramifications of that one moment have lasted 100 years. The trauma
They're still lasting.
The trauma that's associated with that, the economic trauma that's associated with that has continued, and no one has ever answered for that. And so I am becoming more and more convinced there needs to be some kind of legislation in the United States for reparations. I don't know what that looks like, but I think it needs to be in place because we have done a disservice, especially to African American communities in the United States. And there needs to be justice done before we can get to reconciliation.
And there need to be Black voices at the helm of those
100%.
decisions. Yeah, we don't need a white knight. We don't need a white knight riding in to save us. We need to ask people who have lived in those communities, who've experienced and continue to experience racism, and let them decide what that looks like, in my opinion.
No, you're absolutely right. And one story, just a microcosm of that, we heard there was a local beauty salon owner that had a shop. Her salon was located on Greenwood up until this year. And she had a thriving business. Things are going well. She loved her location. She's in a historic district, lives in the neighborhood. And she noticed that her landlords, who predominantly white, as the 100th anniversary continued to get closer, the rent started going up until this last year, it tripled. And there was no way for her. I mean, it just cut her profit completely. And so she sued her landlord that you're exploiting the situation. You are price gouging me, trying to profit off the backs of this massacre that took place 100 years ago. And she lost in court, and she had to move out. She was evicted and had to move out, and she's at another location now. But it's just it's really
insult
sickening.
To injury.
Right. And this. I think what you said is so important from the standpoint, we don't need a white community telling us what the answers to the situation should be. We need Black leaders. We need the African American community to tell us how can we make America better for them? How can we help them develop their neighborhoods, what education. We need those voices, and they are out there. And I've been hearing from those voices all week, and I've just been inspired. I mean, just absolutely been inspired listening to them. So,
and it sort of ties into our interview with Elizabeth that's coming up next. Her book Brave Church, talking through topics together. Something that I feel like I've been learning since 2016 is to listen to Black voices, to listen to LGBTQ voices, to listen to immigrant voices, to Muslim voices, to Palestinian voices, to whoever voices who have been silenced. We need to listen. And one voice that has been really silenced in our church culture is the hurting. We shush over them with a Jesus Band-Aid, and it hasn't been discussed. And so even though the topic seems sort of disparate, I think there's a tie there.
No, I completely agree. And so that's why I think you're going to really enjoy our visit with Reverend Elizabeth Hagan and her new book that has just recently been released, Brave Church. Man, it's been an incredible week, Autumn. Ready to get back home, but boy, I wouldn't trade this time for anything. It's been really inspiring, been heartbreaking, but also inspiring. So stay tuned with Autumn and I as we sit down with Elizabeth Hagan.
Discovering Wholeness is a new podcast from Good Faith Media for healing trauma, for unearthing self.
Because trauma is so pervasive in our communities, it comes into our spiritual spaces, our churches. And I'm wondering how trauma is expressed in religious communities.
My experience of of sitting in the pain, the shame, and the terror at times with some of the people that I have sat with that have experienced that judgment, but to the degree of those kinds of really strong words like abomination and you're going to hell. And it's so heart-wrenching.
I'm Kendall Rothis, an author, feminist theologian, ordained minister, and spiritual director. Join me and my colleagues, Kendra Frazier and Jillian Drader, as we gather each week to discuss trauma and spirituality, to stay grounded as we heal ourselves and walk alongside those who are healing. Join us and learn more at goodfaithmedia.org.
Welcome back to Good Faith Weekly. And on this week's episode, we've got a very special guest with us all the way from South Georgia, Reverend Elizabeth Hagan. Elizabeth has been doing ministry for over 15 years as pastor in congregations all over the U.S. She most recently served at Palisades Community Church in Washington, D.C. She was ordained in the American Baptist tradition in 2006, but has been warmly welcomed in recent years by the Disciples of Christ, the United Church of Christ, and the Presbyterian USA, as well as other sister denominations. If she was going to pick, though, what church she fit into the best, it would be in the African American Gospel Service.
Amen. Yes, same.
Elizabeth is an author who believes in telling vulnerable stories. For 8 years, she struggled with miscarriage, infertility, and adoption loss. She previously wrote about a book about her loss and a memoir called Birth. Her new book, Brave Church, Tackling Tough Topics Together, is an honest and revealing conversation about life's most difficult moments. And you can find her book at elizabethhagan.com/Brave Church. She's also, on a personal note, married to Kevin. They are parents to one particular little girl and to other adopted kids all over the world through their foundation they started called Our Courageous Kids. Elizabeth, wow, you are incredibly busy, but thank you so much and welcome to Good Faith Weekly.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
We're very glad that you're here, Elizabeth. So as everyone is aware, we've been in a global pandemic for well over a year now. It seems like about 17 years to some of us.
Absolutely.
So much has, right? I mean, if you're trying to cage young children in your home, it has been eons.
Yeah.
So much has changed over the course of this last year. People are reimagining their lives these days. How did the pandemic affect you, and what life practices are you instilling in your life as a result?
Well, I was actually just having this conversation with a friend recently. I was saying, I think there's so many people that have done some amazing things during the shutdown and the pandemic. Like they've learned to bake bread, or they've learned to crochet, or they've had these really awesome spiritual disciplines that they never had. And I would say that my discipline through the pandemic has been survival because
it's an important one,
right? Because I had a preschool kid at home who refused to go to Zoom preschool. I mean, who really wants to go to Zoom preschool? That I was trying to manage. You mentioned that I'm connected with a foundation called Our Courageous Kids. We had a student who was studying actually at Southwestern Oklahoma State from Kenya. And she, we were her kind of go-to family for breaks. Well, she came home for spring break in March 2020 and didn't leave for a long time. So I gave an extra daughter. I also had my job at the church. And I also was doing some social media work for the Kids in Need Foundation based in Minnesota. So some days I thought, how am I sleeping? How is this even possible? I just said, my motto was, we're doing the best we can. And is everyone taking baths and is eating? And did I remember to, make sure there's groceries? Then we're all doing okay. So
I will just tell you a quick confession, dear listeners. My children bathed way less during this time. Like they're not out with other people. So we just have learned we don't require as much cleaning.
I have a 4-year-old. I think there's a period where she did not brush her hair for a couple of days. Curly hair is really cute, but I'm not going to fight you on the brushing the hair. No. I'm just going to keep going.
That's great. Is there any, during the pandemic, and we've talked to other guests about this, obviously this has been a very traumatic year for all of us. We've been cooped up in our houses, and using your words, we've just really been trying to survive. How would you say, as a theologian, as a minister, as a parent, how has the pandemic affected you, and what changes have you seen over the last year, as now we're hopefully on the other side of this?
Oh goodness, I think that's like a whole. Our whole lives have changed. I mean, I can answer that question
Yeah, right.
in so many different ways, right?
Mhm.
I in the beginning, I remember when it started, I felt a lot of hope as a pastor because I realized that their lives, even though this was terrible thing was happening, we had so much fear and so much potential of people dying, and people did die, and that was terrible. But the sense of like a greater spiritual longing and awareness that was going on in each of our lives, I really noticed that as a pastor. One of my own spiritual ministry practices I do is I have a email that I send out every Sunday called Word of the Week, where I pick just one word and I explain on the definition and how that might encourage the readers throughout the week. And I was writing those just related to the pandemic. And I recently went back and read some of the words that I wrote, during the height of it, March, April, May, and June. And I could feel in those writings, a sense of panic and a sense of grief, but also a sense of hope, because we were having to get serious again about things that were really important in our lives, like all the extra stuff of like, well, my kid's got to be in this class, or we have to plan this vacation, or, we have to plan this birthday party, like all of that stopped. And we were just kind of doing life at a very basic level. And I think even though it was hard, I think some beautiful things did come out of that. And I saw in my church, we got closer together because we were doing all these Zoom things. I would have people that wouldn't come to, in-person Bible studies or activities just because in Washington, D.C., where my church was, life is hard and traffic is terrible if you've been there.
Right.
Like I want to come, but I'm stuck in traffic. But
Sure.
There's not much of an excuse when there's Zoom. And, we had these Wednesday night kind of just check-ins every week. And I really felt like we grew as a community because we were all in it together in a really meaningful way.
It's beautiful. Yeah, I love that. And speaking of that, now that we are hopefully coming out of this pandemic mindset, and things are certainly opening up across this country at least, there seems to be this kind of rush to return to normalcy, whatever that means, especially when the church is concerned. And you're somebody, Elizabeth, that I read. I appreciate your insights and your thoughts on what's going on within Christianity, within the trends of the church. But it seems like in this rush to normalcy, with everything opening back up, it seems like we're missing out on an opportunity for significant transformation. After everything that has happened this last year, it seems like the church should have transformed to be more prophetic in their voice, to speak into some of the issues that you're going to be talking about. We're going to talk about those here in just a second in the book. Do you think that it seems as though the church is rushing too quickly to get back to the way things were pre-pandemic, and we're losing an opportunity for real transformation to do something new and robust coming out of the pandemic?
Oh, absolutely. I agree. There is a great opportunity for all of us who care about good things going on in the church, larger spiritual community that we're all a part of. But I see so many of my colleagues who are pastors being very weary right now because they have been through so much of just managing all of the personalities and expectations. We've all seen and experienced this pandemic in a different way in terms of what our comfort level is with masks, with vaccines, with social distancing. We've all been affected. Some of us have had family members that have died. Some churches have really lost pillars from this pandemic that are never coming back. And I just feel like so many folks are taking out some of that pain and that grief and that loss on their pastors, because pastors have had to make some really difficult decisions, whether to open when people wanted it to be closed, or closed when they wanted the church to be open, or to do an online program or not to do an online program, or to keep certain ministries or not keep certain ministries. And so I just think this is a time when we need to extend to one another more grace, because we're all coming out of a season of trauma. I mean, when we lived through months and days where we didn't know, when we're going to see our loved ones again, and if we were going to get sick, or when was a vaccine coming, and when were we going to get it, or what was our place in the line? It's been a collective experience of trauma, and we want to do good things coming out of this. We want to be more innovative and effective. But I think just to take a moment and to have a pause and to acknowledge that we've all been through something really intense would help us as we begin to move into the new thing.
And see, that's exactly why I read and appreciate everything you write. So thank you for that.
So in addition to trying to keep your child clean and schooled this past year, you also wrote a book. So did you actually write it during the pandemic?
No, that would have never happened.
Okay. I was like, man, you needed to class and concentration.
Oh gosh, no. Well, see, I can tell you the inside story, which is I wrote it the summer of 2019, and it was supposed to come out last summer, August of 2020. And I was getting the big round of edits right in March. And I remember seeing them on my computer and crying, saying, okay, I will give you any advance money you gave me back. I'm tired. I cannot do this. And I'm such a task completer. And if you tell me, to be there, I will be there. I just couldn't even believe myself that I was telling, this big, exciting thing in my life. No. But I was like, look, I actually said to the editor, I was like, we're in a pandemic. Do these topics even matter anymore? I think we're going to be on something else, another journey. And maybe this book just doesn't need to be in the world. But they were really kind at Upper Room, my publisher, and said, of course, no, just chill. We understand you're going through a lot of things. Let's delay it a couple months. Let the world calm down a bit. And I got childcare back last fall. Thanks be to the Lord. I was able
Bless his holy name. Yes.
The revival broke out across the land among parents everywhere.
And so here we are. I call it a COVID delayed book, but I think in many ways, Brave Church is coming out at just the right time, because
agreed.
We need brave churches.
I know we do.
Yes.
In this new world, we need, what if we began to think about our ministry, and not in the ways of we've always done this program, or we've always had this type of ministry. What if we began talking about real life?
Yes.
That's something that I think has the power to make our communities more bold, more effective, and more welcoming to those who most need church right now.
Yeah. In fact, Autumn told a quote from the book that you just mentioned. So Autumn, that quote I thought was great that you pulled.
Yeah. So it sounds like you grew up in a pretty typical church experience. You're right.
Absolutely.
We talked about God, Jesus, and the Bible. We talked about Christmas pageants, bake sales, and chili suppers. We talked about outreach campaigns, volunteer missions, and Sunday school, but we never talked about real life. We never talked about the part of life that made us sad, scared, angry, and ashamed. Why doesn't the church talk about these raw and honest emotions?
Well, you just read one of my favorite parts of the book, and that's really sums it up why I wrote Brave Church, is because I grew up in a good little Southern Baptist church in Chattanooga, Tennessee. It was good people doing with good intentions, trying to do the right thing, trying to love God, trying to love Jesus, trying to love their neighbor. But the thing that I always noticed about the congregation that formed me and shaped me was that there were so many times when things happened that we just didn't even mention, like the youth minister got divorced and they fired him, or someone in the youth group had an eating disorder and went away and we never addressed it, or someone was struggling with depression and no one would ever say that word, depression. And I've always thought that the gospel, if it's going to be good news, it can't be just good news to, a life beyond, which is great, but it has to be good news for the world in which we're living in right now. And it has to be good news for all of us, not just parts of us. And I think we have such a hard time talking about topics that I write about in Brave Church, such as infertility, miscarriage, mental health, racism, sexuality, because we're afraid. And also because there's so much shame that we've put on these topics just because we don't have a tradition of talking about them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you chose, and it's great leading into my next question, because the topics you chose to write about in Brave Church, they're really weighty. And so I know that, especially working through the material, some of them were very personal to you. Mm-hmm. Why did you personally select these specific topics to write about in the book?
Well, that I thought that they were some of the most relevant topics that related to things that I had seen and experienced that were just not talked about. And the order of the book is very intentional. I start with the first topic is infertility and miscarriage. The statistics say that 1 in 8 couples in America will struggle with infertility, and 10 to 15% of pregnancies will end in miscarriage. I think that everybody knows somebody that's either been through it or going through it right now. And so that's how I started, because I thought, when you're in a group, and the whole intention of Brave Church is this is not just let's just start talking, but let's have some intentionality around it. Let's covenant together in a different kind of way so that we're able to go deeper with one another. I thought, well, that's a great way to start the book. And the next topic is mental illness. So many of us have experienced that beyond just, feeling blue one day or needing, a mental break. We know people for whom mental illness in all its different forms has shaped their life. I talk about domestic violence because I think we do a lot of damage in the church with our theology around women and around forgiveness that keeps those who are in difficult situations of family, not talking about their pain and continuing to suffer. The theological teachings around, in particular, patriarchy and who's in leadership in churches, I thought was really important to bring forth to light on that topic. And then racism. One interesting thing about the racism chapter is I was telling you I wrote the book in 2019, the first draft. Well, it completely got rewritten in 2020 after we lived through the summer of Black Lives Matter and of the murder of George Floyd. And one cool thing about the book is that in each chapter, I'm going to point you to 2 innovative ministries or churches that are doing something cool in that area. And so what I actually did is I went back to the 2 churches that I featured in the racism chapter. One was a predominantly white church and another was a African-American church. And I asked them, how were they responding to the Black Lives Matter movement, which was really cool to see their witness in action in this current time. And then sexuality. How could you write a book about being brave or talking about tough topics if you don't mention that one? Because we've seen it divide with such strong opinions throughout Christian denominations. So that's
well, it was a great choice of topics. And I think, like you said, every one of them are extremely important and germane to what's going on in culture today. So well done in selecting those.
Well, and I love that it's not Brave Pastor.
No.
It's not Brave Sunday school teacher. No. It's Brave Church. Like we have to be brave together because, Mitch and I both have, I'm sure you do too. We have friends who are in leadership at churches who are getting pretty roughed up over their statements about, race and sexuality and all of these things that have been on fire since summer of 2020. And so I think that's such an important thing to say that it takes all of us together.
It does. And I want to tell you this. I mean, this book is not what Elizabeth Hagan thinks on all these topics. I worked really hard to not make it about me, because I believe in, like what you're saying, of the church coming together and holding intention when we have different ideas and different experiences. And I intentionally pulled sources as I was talking through and teaching on these topics from a variety of different theological spectrums. I mean, because I didn't want someone to think that I was writing a manifesto that then would keep them from engaging in the conversation. You know, as a pastor, the thing that I always feel so happy about whenever I'm leading a small group or any type of session is when people are in the same room and they start sharing with one another. I mean, I may have a plan and an agenda, like what I want to see happen, but if they are present and talking with one another and sharing things that are real going on in their lives, I'm like, I've won. This is amazing. Yeah. And that's really my hope for Brave Church, is that people be in the same room, intentionally commit to doing this work together, and just listen.
And speaking of that, you offer some rules for productive and healthy conversations for the Brave Church. So without giving away everything, because we want people to buy the book, can you speak a little bit, like what rule is more essential for these significant conversations to be productive?
Well, here's one of my favorite ones. You know, I think a lot of times in churches, we say a lot about, well, let's just agree to disagree. I mean, we've all heard that.
Oh, that was brilliant.
Let's not get political.
It's like, yeah, on some of these issues, I'm not going to agree to disagree with you on this one.
Because you're wrong.
Yeah, I have a good friend who said, you know, agree to disagree is just code for I like you too much to argue with you. Isn't that true?
Yes.
And the first Brave Space rule says this, that we will accept conflict and commit to the way of kindness. Yeah. I think we have this idea that if we're going to talk about anything in a faith context, that we have to agree, or that we have to come at it from the same perspective. But I think conflict is really important because that's how we hear each other. And it's how we handle it, committing to the way of kindness. That's important. You know, I've had colleagues that have said to me, you know, I don't know why you said that in this meeting, or have you looked at it this way, or I felt hurt when you offered the prayer in this way. And those are moments of real learning. I mean, I'm sure you've had those in your lives as well. Yes. When someone has said something very direct to you and you feel terrible in the moment, but you are so thankful in the long run because you learn about someone's experience at a deep level, and it changes things.
Sorry, you talk in the chapter, like continue to listen. It's toward the end, I think. Are still listening? I want to get the title.
Yeah, let's keep talking. Yeah.
Keep talking. Yes.
Yeah.
But you talk about a friend who flies frequently, or did, I guess, to India doing humanitarian work. Mm-hmm. And you said to her, you said to her, like, wouldn't it be great if we could just basically teleport and, you know, be there so quickly? And I love what she said, that she enjoys the time that it takes because it gives her time to sort of recenter herself. And I think that's sort of what this time has been. This, you know, I feel like the word liminal space started like popping like popcorn right around the time that the quarantine began. Like I'd never heard that word before. And then suddenly every Christian I knew was talking about liminal space. And I think you even mentioned it in the chapter, but that's what this time has given us, to sort of recenter and to take a minute and to strip away all those distractions. And so everything that you're saying is so important. And when we're in, I know me personally, like from 2016 to 2020, like I was on fire, you know, like it was hard for me to listen to what people were saying because I was just agog at what was going on. Mm-hmm. And so, but now I do feel like I can have those conversations with people, and not in a agree to disagree kind of way, but to have those meaningful things have scabbed over a bit, if that makes sense. And that's what I loved about that chapter that you wrote.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah. And I think we do need that in between time. You know, I mean, it would be great. That song I play all the time. It was popular a couple of years ago. Wake me up when it's all over. You know. Anyway, I think about that. Sometimes I just want to be woken up when all this craziness is over, and when we're on a more consistent plane of not so much conflict in our country. But I think to be in the tension and to be in the conflict is really our calling as Christians, and to bring hope to those for whom have felt like their pain has been ignored in the church. Their pain has not been validated. Just think about all those who have experienced racism as a result. I mean, I know that this is something you're passionate about as well, but racism as a result of the way that we formed our churches. And if we can't talk about that and name it for what it is, how in the world can we ever move on from it? So, we need this in between time to do some really important work amongst ourselves.
What I really like about what you're advocating for, and not only with this book, Elizabeth, but with what you've done in your career, is that you are really advocating for a genuine, authentic, transparent, honest faith, and also a church, a transparent church, to be open to just accepting ourselves with all of our flaws, all of our history, all of our downfalls, so that we can make a better community moving forward. The book is dealing with some very vulnerable issues. I know, in your previous writings as well as this one, you have been very vulnerable and telling your own stories. To me, and certainly feel free to disagree with me, it seems as though you are saying if the church really wants to be relevant for the future and to be able to minister on a larger, broader spectrum, then we have to let the people see that we are struggling through life just like they are. We have made mistakes just like the rest of the world, but we want to do this together and get and be better as we strive towards, following the words of Jesus.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you said this is not Brave Pastor, this is Brave Church, but I think it does start with the leadership. If you see your leader vulnerably talking about things, then you're going to feel like, well, okay, maybe it's okay for me too. It takes, what is that? Pass it on, takes a spark to get the fire going, It's so true. One statistic that I encountered that was a part of the mental illness chapter was a study that was done by Lifeway several years ago, and it was about mental illness. And it said that 94% of pastors that they surveyed knew that there was someone in their church that was struggling with mental health or mental illness, but only 12% of them said they'd ever uttered that from the pulpit or talked about it openly. And that, I remember the day that I read that, and I just was caught in my tracks, just with my jaw dropped, Houston, we have a problem. This is really bad. Mm-hmm. When we know that people in our pews are suffering, we know that they are dealing with experiences that make them feel isolated and alone and lost, and we don't even name what is going on and how this is affecting not only individuals, but those who love them. We have to do better. And, it is risky. And, some people have said to me when they know about this book coming out, well, don't you know, this is kind of like putting you in a category of the girl who talks about things that nobody wants to talk about. How are you ever going to fit in mainstream church? I'm like, well, I don't know. Maybe I don't want to fit in. Maybe the people that need the good news the most are those for whom have felt left out by our traditional church practices. And maybe in running to them and helping them know that they're seen and loved, that the good news comes just a little bit more into our world. And that's what gets me excited about church. Yeah. And that's the kind of church I want to go to, where I feel like I don't have to pretend when I show up, that I can be sad because something really bad happened to me this week, or I can be angry because there's so much injustice in this world, or I can be frustrated because, someone in my family made a really terrible life choice again. I want to believe that that's possible. And so that's why I wrote Brave Church.
Well, the book is Brave Church, Tackling Tough Topics Together. You can find where you can purchase the book at elizabethhagan.com/Brave Church. Reverend Hagan, thank you so much for being on Good Faith Weekly. It was a delight to visit with you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Mitch, before we let her go,
Well, I was about to open the door for you, Autumn. So
you were really like, it was that part of the church where the pastor closes his Bible and you're like, wait a minute, it's not quite time for that yet. He's gonna do a sneaky story to us. Here's what's going to happen. That was my favorite part of church as a little girl. I'm like, yes, it's time for lunch.
Yeah.
And then you get the second sermon during the invitation.
Right. They're going to play Just As I Am 4 times.
One more time, right?
Our tagline at Good Faith Media is there's more to tell. So in light of everything that we've talked about and that you've lived and written about, Elizabeth, what is your more to tell?
Well, I believe that Brave Church's magic comes not just in a person buying the book and reading them themselves, but in getting a Brave Church group together and committing to do this study for anywhere from 4 to 6 to 7 weeks, however much time you have as a group, and really digging into it. So this is what I'm offering, and I would love to connect with your listeners about this. This fall, I'm starting a cohort of brave churches who are willing to get a group together and to do this book, formation, curriculum, whatever that looks like in their context. And for those who are part of this fall cohort, I am going to commit to being present with them on Zoom or whatever way makes the most sense, and being a support to their leader. So touch with me if that's something that interests you, because I think that doing a group is pretty magical. I taught this at my church as I was writing it as well, and learned a lot from that experience. So excited about some brave churches getting going this fall.
Love
it. Well, Elizabeth, again, thank you so much for being on Good Faith Weekly. We wish you the very best. Try to stay cool down there in that summer southern Georgia heat.
I will. Thank you.
Elizabeth Hagan, thank you so much for being with us today. To our audience, we want to thank you for tuning in to Good Faith Weekly. And as always, until next week, keep living good faith.